Let's look at section 4.5, Introduction to Factoring Polynomials. The key to any factoring problem is to always count the number of terms, and that'll tell you how to proceed with your factoring. So if you look at page 327, number 18, 22, and 34, notice that every problem here has 4 terms. So when you see 4 or more terms, the method of factoring that we're going to use is to factor by grouping. And the way factoring by grouping works is we will group the first 2 and the last 2 terms, and I'm underlining them just to show you which ones we're putting together. And we look at the first 2 terms and we want to factor out the greatest common factor, which happens to be x. And then in parentheses, we're going to have a plus b. From the last 2 terms, the greatest common factor will be -5. Factor that out, and then you have to be careful because when we factor out a negative number, the signs will change inside the parentheses, which you will get a plus b. And you can always check your work. If you were to distribute -5 back into the parentheses, you have to get back to the original -5a minus 5b, which we do. So you can always check your work. So this is our first step. When you're factoring by grouping, you have to make sure that the binomial in the parentheses, both cases, that these are exactly the same. If they are exactly the same, then you have done your first step correctly, and you go on to your second step. Since we have a plus b in both of these parts, a plus b is now your greatest common factor. We factor that out, and what you're left with is just x minus 5. And that will be our final answer. And also notice that since we are multiplying here, you can also write your answer as x minus 5 times a plus b. So these two are equivalent. You just need one of them as your answer. Let's move on to 22. So again, we have 4 terms. We're going to use factor by grouping. And for the most part, the terms will be in the correct order. But if the terms are in the wrong order, you might have to rewrite the problem. But for the most part, they'll be in the correct order. And we're just going to group the first 2 and the last 2. This problem is slightly different because if you notice from the last 2 terms, we don't have a GCF, which is okay. So we're going to actually just leave this the way it is, but make a minor change, and I will show you. Factor out the y plus no GCF, so what you can do to help you is write 1 parentheses a plus b. So this is equivalent to just having a plus b, but it's going to help us in the second step. Because notice, again, you have to make sure that what's in the parentheses is exactly the same, which it is. And so a plus b is our GCF, greatest common factor. So we have a plus b parentheses y plus 1, and that's now completely factored, and that's our final answer. Okay, finally number 34. Again, grouping. Group the first 2, group the last 2. From the first 2 terms, our GCF will be 2x squared y. And then we have our parentheses, and we're going to get x minus 10. Now from the last 2 terms, you have to factor out a -3. because when we do that, we're going to get x minus 10. Remember, these have to be exactly the same, and so we did have to factor out a -3, otherwise we would not get x minus 10, and it wouldn't match the first part. Make sure that you understand that the sign here needs to be a negative, because when we distribute -3 back into the parentheses, you have to get -3x plus 30. And so now we have the same terms, same binomial, and so we factor x minus 10 times 2x squared y minus 3. And that would be our final answer.